Hello, everyone. Welcome to another season of 19V. I'm Margaret Shamu from Parsons School of Design at the New School. We'd like to thank the Jordan Center at New York University for supporting our meetings. I'm delighted to introduce today's session, a presentation of a new book titled Courtly Gifts and Cultural Diplomacy, Art, Material Culture, and British-Russian Relations. First, we'll hear from the volume's editor, Louise Hardiman, independent scholar, and then we'll have the three contributors. Ekaterina Heath of University of Sydney, Alison Lee, University of Louisiana at Lafayette, and Cynthia Coleman-Spark, an independent Fabergé consultant. After the speakers, then we'll hear from today's собеседник, Ekaterina Pravilova from Princeton University. So over to you, Louise.
So we now, in the book, we focus on the late 17th century onwards. And this lapse or this gap in scholarship is really illustrated by the fact that we have a work like this one, an early painting thought to be by an English artist, but no one knows who it's by. And this is of the Prozorovsky embassy in the late 17th century. So this is where we start the book. The first thematic section is art and diplomacy with 3 chapters, of which one is mine. And that chapter starts in the late 17th with 2 portraits by the Stuart court painter Godfrey Kneller. And the portrait on the right, Peter I, will be very familiar to everyone here, a very well-known image. The one on the left of Pyotr Potyomkin, perhaps not so well known, and he was the Russian ambassador at its time. So what I do in my chapter is I discuss the creation histories of those portraits, but also try to situate them in a wider context and talk about their afterlives as well. For example, this engraving by John Smith, which really speaks to the diplomatic context and shows, as you can see, the furs that are draped around the side of the portrait, and then the reference to the bear and the lion that you see in the lower half of the engraving. So then we have a chapter by Anthony Cross. This focuses on a diplomatic couple called the Cathcards, and like many of the authors, Tony Cross has gone to an unknown archive of the diplomatic family and dug out some details of these encounters to illustrate the fact that actually it's not just the diplomat himself, but it's actually his wife who is involved in negotiating some of these connections, some of these contacts which bring English art into the court of Catherine. We then have a chapter from Yelizaveta Renner from the State Hermitage Museum, who's done a lot of work on British-Russian exchanges in painting, and she talks about the commissions from Joshua Reynolds and including the commissions for Potyomkin, the other far more well-known Grigory Potyomkin. So then we have 4 case studies on gift giving. And these include 2 of the speakers who you'll be hearing from today. So I will focus on the other 2. Firstly, Caroline de Guiteau. Caroline is the co-curator of the collection of the Russian art exhibition, but also senior curator in the Royal Collection. And she discusses some little known material from the 19th century, again from Royal Archives, on the gift exchanges between Queen Victoria and 4 Russian czars. So some interesting material there. And then bringing in another aspect of gift giving over the centuries, Olga Sobolyov talks about the gift of a borzoi hound to the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson. And this chapter brings in some of the context of literary connections too, and this broader theme of animals as diplomatic gifts over the years. So then we come to travels and dialogues, and this is a section which focuses more on the exchange of artists and ideas between the 2 countries. So we have a chapter from Zelina Tetamazova And she brings in printmaking. She discusses two printmakers, Gavril Skarodumov and James Walker, each of whom were imperial printmakers, but each of whom worked in the countries of the other. And it illustrates the fact that in the book, I tried to bring in lots of different examples of visual culture. So lots of different media involved. Then we have a Nicholas I chapter. This is a chapter by Irina Marisina, and she discusses the little known interest in British art of Nicholas I when he was Grand Duke and conducted a grand tour of Britain, and in the course of this tour met up with a couple of artists, William Allen, the Scottish painter, and Benjamin Robert Hayden, the English artist. So finally, the final section is on dynasties and domesticities. And this is just 2 chapters, but brings us to the late 19th century with a chapter from Stephen Patterson, a co-curator of the Royal Exhibition. And he discusses the visual commemoration of the wedding of Alexander II's daughter, Maria Alexandrovna, and Prince Alfred, Queen Victoria's son. And what Patterson does, which is really interesting, is delves into the diplomatic side of things too, all of that correspondence, all of the behind the scenes with Queen Victoria, and the ways in which the visual side was matched by this the diplomatic history as well. And then we come to the end of the book with a chapter on photography by Wendy Slater, and she looks at image making of Nicholas II and draws that into dialogue with the image making strategies of the British rulers over the same period, and really takes into account this the domestic relations between the two families, which are illustrated so nicely by this well-known image of Nicholas II and his cousin George, who would become George V. So Slater brings us right up to not only the end of the imperial period, but she also takes her chapter forward to the present day, sort of looking at how those after the afterlives of that imagery. So it's a very rich volume with lots and lots of overlapping and interesting different aspects to it, as you'll see when you hear from the speakers. So I shall now stop sharing and hand over to our first speaker, Katja Heath. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katarina Heath. I'm from the University of Sydney. In my chapter, I was focused on 3 diplomatic gifts sent on behalf of King George III to Russia in 1795-96. So he sent a telescope, a Herschel telescope, to Catherine the Great. Empress Grand Duchess Maria Feodorovna received a group of 200 exotic plants from the Kew Gardens, and the plants were quite. What was exceptional about it was that the plants arrived not in a seed form; they were fully formed. They came in pots, which was at the time was very hard to achieve. It was a very impressive gift. And the final gift I looked at was the gift of 6 horses for Paul I. So for me, these gifts were quite unusual, and I wanted to know what they signified in the context of the time and in relation to each other. So this was an important period in Russian history. Catherine the Great's reign was coming to an end. And the British government seek to establish relationship with the new, heirs to the throne. And we can see what was interesting about these gifts is that they were different. So in the past, the British government primarily sent semantically neutral gifts like porcelain or silverware. So these gifts normally had either neutral meaning or positive meaning, whereas this set of gifts had very complex meaning, and sometimes they could be interpreted as even as veiled threats. So for me, that was quite unusual. Also, these gifts were related to science and natural history. This was a very new category of gifts that the British Empire started to send to various countries. And yeah, I found that quite fascinating. I was also interested in both the conception of the gift, so what the senders were planning to communicate to Russia, but I also found it interesting to compare that to the way the gifts were received in Russia, which was they were quite controversial when they were received. So this is why I worked both in the National Archives in London, but also in the archives in Russia. And finally, I set myself a challenge to look at this gift from the point of view of material culture. So I looked at them quite closely to determine what they meant in the context of the time. So my main argument was that this category of gifts, the three gifts, represented the new strategy for the British authorities. They started sending, and they were prepared to take risks when sending diplomatic gifts to other countries. And I also, in my chapter, talked about so-called symbolic violence of gift giving. So the point of giving gifts that had negative meaning, and some of these gifts did have negative meanings, and I'll discuss that in a minute. The point was to force the opposing powers to give their country concessions in return to gifts. So in the context of this period, the British government wanted to pursue trade goals. They wanted to sign an agreeable new trade agreement with Russia on their terms, and they also needed Russian help in the war against revolutionary France. And they wanted to, Catherine the Great sent quite a lot of soldiers to the war. So the choice of gifts of plants and technology represented a high point in that strategy, abandoning the preceding tradition of sending semantically positive or neutral gifts of silverware and art. And one of the gifts, one second, for some reason I can't finish. Okay, so one of the gifts that was the most was a good example of that strategy is the gift sent to Maria Fedorovna, and she received plants. And on the surface of it, this is a semantically neutral gift because these are plants. Women are meant to be interested in botany, so plants are all about self-improvement, cultivating one's soul. And some of the plants, as I said, had quite neutral meaning. For example, this is Strelitzia regina, which is a reference to George III's wife, Caroline. So the wife of George III. The plant came from the south of Africa. So it's just a beautiful gift symbolizing the connection between the two countries, between two consorts. The second gift, the second plant, was the Brucia antidysenterica, which is, again, it has a wonderful meaning because this plant was used to prevent dysentery. And this was one of the main killers during the war. So you can interpret it as a reference to and a kind of hint towards Russian potential involvement in the war against revolutionary France. And this was a very useful plant because it prevented dysentery, and as I said, it was the main reason for many people dying in the battlefield. More people died from dysentery than in the battlefield itself. So the plant that caused the most controversy, it looks quite innocent. It looks, it's called, New Zealand flax, and it comes from Norfolk Island. And the person who chose the plant was Joseph Banks, the famous botanist and explorer. So what this plant is what was significant about that plant is that it produced very strong fibers that were perfect for creating, potentially creating sails for the British Navy. So the problem at the time was that the British Navy relied very heavily on Russian flax and hemp. And when the relationship between the two countries was good, that was all right, but it became more and more turbulent. And the British authorities were starting to think, okay, we need to have a plan B, we need to diversify our sources. They tried getting flax from Poland and other sources, and all these strategies kind of kept failing. And so getting sales from New Zealand was a new strategy, and they were hoping that they would be able to grow New Zealand flax en masse in Sydney. So that was one of the main reasons why Sydney was founded. So the gifts of plant had both very good semantic meanings, but also some veiled threats, basically saying, if you don't agree to, you don't sign the trade agreement on conditions that we like, we will start to, look into other options. For Russia, flax was very important at the time because it was one of the main sources of its income. So my chapter had several themes. First theme was the importance of science as for demonstrating superiority. So it wasn't just a friendly gift. Gifts of telescopes were given at the time by the British Empire, were demonstrations of superiority, and people and recipients knew that. For example, when Chinese emperor in 1793 received a telescope from Britain, he said that now that the tribute envoy has seen that there are also people in the celestial empire who are versed in astronomy, geography, and clock repairing, he can no longer boast that he alone has got the secret. Presumably, he has begun to stop boasting. So in that case, actually, that Ambassador Macartney, he actually failed, and his gift did not impress the Chinese emperor, and that was a failure of the diplomatic strategy. And Russians actually very frequently repurposed the diplomatic gifts from Britain, the gifts of technology, and presented them as something produced by the Russian Empire. When they, for example, went to Japan, they showed the Japanese scientific instruments and gave British scientific instruments to the Japanese, saying that they were actually produced in Russia. The second theme is the idea of women and science. But that was quite a controversial idea. Some sciences were allowed for women, like botany, but others, like astronomy, were more controversial. And here we have a kind of print showing, wife of, actually, sister of Herschel, who was Caroline Herschel. She was interested in astronomy as well, and she found quite a few planets and herself. But here she's being criticized. As you can see, she's watching Cupid fart, and she thinks that this is a meteorite. So women actually very often criticized and humiliated for their interest in astronomy. And the final two themes was the importance of economics. Economics in the early modern diplomacy. For example, the Herschel telescope, its tube was made of mahogany, which at the time was the symbol of power and imperial expansion, because that timber was very important for the British, because it ensured the profitability of West Indian trade. It was perfect for filling the hulls of ships that were returning to Britain empty after the sale of African slaves. So economics was always something that the British were thinking. And finally, reception. So, as I said, there was quite a lot of controversy when these gifts were received in Russia. And in fact, Catherine the Great instead offered to pay for her telescope. Instead of receiving it as a gift, as it was meant by George III, she actually said, and she actually paid for it, because a purchase presumes a relatively equal relationship, whereas a gift make one of the parties indebted to the other. So this is why it was quite confusing that Catherine actually chose to pay for her telescope. So to conclude, the three gifts delivered to Russia in the end of the 18th century demonstrate a shift in the British diplomacy in choosing to communicate assertive messages of power, alternated with more traditionally benign gifts of plants. By adding symbolic aggression to their diplomatic toolkit, the British relied on the polysemic character of gifts and ambiguities, cross-cultural communication and understanding. Its continued use of British diplomacy well into the 19th century highlights that its successes outweighed its potential risks. So British government continued, once they have set the precedent with these gifts, they continued sending this kind of semantically aggressive gifts to other countries throughout the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you, Kasia. We'll hear next from Alison.
As you might be able to guess from looking at the title from my chapter in the volume, which you see on the screen here, I was really interested in putting several things in dialogue at once. Two artists, both English, one Tsar, very Russian, and a singular monument made between 1819 and 1828, now known as the St. Petersburg Military Gallery. I feel like I should probably admit from the outset that I've been fascinated by the portraits that comprise this space for a long time. It might be just the sheer breadth of it all, 329 portraits of generals and 7 full-length depictions of commanders, all of whom fought in the campaigns against Napoleon. I'll never forget the first time that I entered this space, which still exists, much as it did when it first opened in a specially designed hall in the Winter Palace. When I first saw it, I was still a graduate student, and it initially struck me as just a kind of extraordinary pantheon of a very particular kind of militaristic masculinity. But as I thought about it more and more over the years, and then of course began researching it seriously to write this chapter, I made what I think are some important discoveries. I began to think about it not just in terms of these ideals of heroic masculinity, which I do still think it encapsulates, but also in terms of how conceptualizations of masculinity were transmitted between cultures via a very specific form of diplomacy in the first half of the 19th century. For the military gallery really doesn't stand alone. It exists in dialogue with an intriguingly similar monument, the Waterloo Chamber in Windsor Castle, which was commenced by the British during the same period and features 28 portraits of the main commanders, diplomats, and monarchs who had formed an alliance to defeat Napoleon. It was only when I began thinking about both of these portrait galleries together that I realized they provide a singular opportunity to evaluate the ways that diplomacy interacted with portraiture to produce idealized male servitors across national lines. Now, because it would have been impossible to assess all the portraits in these spaces in a single chapter, I ultimately decided to focus deeply on the representations of Tsar Alexander I, which are in both. I began by assessing Alexander's upbringing and some of the early depictions made of him to lay a kind of groundwork for understanding how he was made an emblem for a specific kind of normative masculinity then prevalent in both Russia and Britain. I compared this portrait in particular, painted when Alexander was only 5 or 6 years old, to this one, painted by a German-born artist who Louise actually showed us already earlier, who became the leading portrait painter in England a century before. Both reveal a mix of attributes denoting strength and militarism. Alexander with his child-size sparkling epaulet and the barrel of a gun in his tiny hand, while Duke William there on the right poses in this armored breastplate, which is strapped luxuriously over a creamy shirt. All these details serve to highlight the role these future leaders would take in warfare and statecraft. At the same time, these portraits reveal another aspect of Alexander's early education, which stands in contrast to such traditional ideals. The overall amiability of Alexander's pose, with his left arm gesturing cordially outwards, seems to reflect the values that Catherine the Great sought to impart in him, that an ideal ruler should be mild, humane, and accessible. Such qualities diverged sharply from the advice Alexander received from his tutors, who taught him that a male heir should be grave, severe, and inaccessible to petty considerations. Given such conflicting lessons, it's no wonder that Alexander became known as a moody and indecisive man. Even Napoleon believed that there was, quote, something missing in his character, though he found it impossible to discover what it is. One Austrian diplomat described the Tsar as possessing, quote, a strange mix of the qualities of a man and the weaknesses of a woman. Such contemporary observations led me to think again of the portraits of Alexander made for the military gallery and the Waterloo Chamber. My commissioning George Daw to paint his portrait for the former have been motivated by a wish to shore up his own masculinity by entering a pantheon of militaristic manliness. Alexander had certainly gotten a taste of the potential power such a representation might hold when he was painted by Sir Thomas Lawrence between 1814 and 18, the image you see on the right. Letters written by Lawrence reveal how struck he was by the Tsar's friendliness and lack of formality. For Lawrence, Alexander seemed an impeccable gentleman, albeit one marked by a certain foreignness. He noted the Tsar's ability to speak clearly and forcefully, but without seeming rushed. These traits would have been interpreted by both European and Russian observers as signs of the ruler's enlightened education. They also revealed his mastery over personal impulses, then highly valued for men of elite station. Alas, these attributes would cause problems for Lawrence when it came to completing his portrait of the Tsar. Lawrence depicted Alexander with his hands clasped tightly in front of him, the whiteness of his tight gloves contrasting sharply with the darkness of his trousers, and drawing the eye to the tension in the Tsar's fists. He also stands awkwardly, with all of his weight shifted to one side, so much so that his right knee looks almost painfully hyperextended. This stands in contrast to how Lawrence pictured the other heads of state in the Waterloo Chamber. The majority stand in a loose contrapposto, like Alexander, but none have their arms crossed in front of them, and none look as exposed or uncomfortable. Both of the men nearest to Alexander were both positioned confidently, wearing their clothes with an ease that is acutely lacking in the Russian sovereign. Similar problems might have accrued to George Daw's depiction of Alexander for the military gallery, but Daw proved overall more successful in rendering the Tsar's comportment in a dignified way. Nevertheless, the portraits in the military gallery drew negative reviews especially among members of the English press. I'm sharing one, quote, "There they hang, the labor of 10 plodding years," wrote Charles Lamb in 1831. 400 fierce half-lengths, all male, all military, like the pit in a French theater, Lamb continued, before concluding that all in all, it was a suffocating horde of male chaos. To me, all of this indicates the beginning of a breakdown in the coherence of systems for portraying masculine invulnerability. And it shows that Russia was no more immune to the collapse of stable signifiers for virtuous manhood than Britain was. In the end, even importing an English artist to serve as a kind of cultural diplomat didn't assure a firm footing for the depiction of honorable masculinity. The tradition of historical portraiture was proving unable, excuse me, to stabilize a growing conflict within ideals for manhood and leadership itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Cynthia.
So the subject of my research was an object that was housed in this extremely simple wooden box, which when opened, revealed a lavish presentation gift that shed light on Anglo-Russian imperial visits, on hardstone in official gifting, and on royal protocol. Nestled within the silk-lined case that's stamped Fabergé, you can find a polished agate striated bowl with a jewel-set handle formed as a double-headed eagle. And the hallmark on the handle reveal the maker of this object was headwork master Michael Perkin, who ran the workshops for Fabergé in St. Petersburg between 1886 and 1903. The handle then is further engraved, presented to Victor Albert Lord Churchill by the Tsar Nicholas II, Balmoral, Saturday, 3rd of October, 1886, and offers for us a strong lead into the circumstances of its gifting, but this is not proof positive. This kovsh, for me, provided an ideal case study to share. It also had an inventory number scratched onto its handle. And miraculously, an archivist contact of mine in Russia was able to match the numeric code to rare surviving Fabergé documents. And the firm's inventories then confirmed that the kovsh was supplied at a cost of 355 rubles. And the ledgers of the imperial cabinet, who were documenting gifts by their imperial highnesses during their travels abroad in 1896, cites England, Lord Churchill as the recipient. Now, the first Viscount Churchill, born in 1864 into a family with strong British and political royal links. His mother, Lady Jane Churchill, was the longest serving lady of the bedchamber, and she was also a close confidant of Queen Victoria's. So Victor Albert's position at court was originally defined by his mother's role, but his status as a trusted member of the household certainly survived well beyond his mother's death in 1900. So it's likely that Lord Churchill had met Nicholas II previously, as Churchill not only grew up in the household, but moved in court circles. He served as page of honor to Queen Victoria, and he also assumed further court-appointed roles. And he also served with the Queen's own Oxfordshire Hussars from 1902 to 1918. You see him here standing with that magnificent mustache just to the left of his cousin Winston Churchill in a photograph dated 1903. So Churchill, our Churchill, Victor Albert Churchill, contributed to the success of the 1896 Russian visit to Balmoral, despite the complexities that mired the planned reunion between Empress Alexandra and her grandmother, Queen Victoria. This was to be a stop on a series of courtesy calls mixed with official visits in Europe following the Russian coronation of 1896. The restorative break with English relations was agreed, but these were high-profile visitors who would be more easily targeted in London by anti-Romanov activists, so it was deemed safer to receive them in Scotland. Correspondence between the British and the Russian sides in the lead up to the visit became increasingly fraught as arrangements were altered, with some confusion rising, of course, over Julian versus Gregorian calendar dates, not to mention the sizable retinue accompanying from Russia who had to be accommodated. And behind the scenes, Queen Victoria's closest advisors were working tirelessly to ensure the success of the visit, scheduling entertainment, of course, but also maneuvering opportunities for informal political discussion to try and probe Russia's position on British causes abroad. Now, Lord Churchill was only 4 years older than the Russian monarch, and his position in the Russian household ensured his attendance at Balmoral social events. And a seating plan that's preserved from September the 30th, 1896, just a few days before he received the Kofsch, indicates that Lord Churchill dined with the Queen, with Empress Alexandra, with some of the German royal cousins, and the inner circle of courtiers at a table for 18. And in a situation that was heavily regimented by court protocol, you find members of the Queen's household sitting at one half of the table and royal relations at the other. And curiously, Churchill seems to be sitting on the family side. By comparing Fabergé records with those of gifts presented during that Balmoral visit, it's interesting to know that 3 other guests who were in attendance that evening were also awarded presents from Nicholas II. They are Sir Arthur Bigge, who was the Queen's private secretary, who was presented with a vase of a Siberian jade. It's a material known as nephrite. And this cost 225 rubles. Lord Edward Pelham Clinton, who's the master of the household, received a 600 ruble nephrite knife. And then the Honorable William Carrington, the equerry, received a silver cup mounted with Russian coins valued at 425 rubles. Now, the Russian custom was for the value of the gifts, of official gifts, to reflect the rank of the recipient, but the surviving records seem to show no correlation between the cost of the gift and either the precedence at court or the level of peerage of the recipient. So, in other words, Churchill was by far the youngest and the most junior of the 4 men, and yet his gift was more expensive than Sir Arthur Bigge's. I repeat, the Queen's private secretary at the time. And this seems to underline the esteem with which Churchill was held both as a guest at Queen Victoria's table, as well as a recipient of Nicholas's recognition. So in this instance, the tightly bound protocol that dictated the hierarchy of imperial presentation gifts seems to have been altered, as sometimes happened for gifts that were made abroad and during semi-official visits, which this was. So another line of inquiry that intrigued me that was offered by this Churchill Kofsch illustrated the complexities involved in researching the Hardstone pieces by Fabergé. So the firm and its closest contemporaries and its closest competitors who were retailing unmarked Hardstone objects in the late 19th century have forced us to into a reanalysis of those who were involved in the sourcing, the cutting, and the retailing of Russian hardstones. And it turns out the firm of Werfel, who owned a large stock of hardstones from Siberia and from the Caucasus, were uniquely placed to deliver huge quantities of finished items to Fabergé, acting as court suppliers. And because carvers in Ida Oberstein in Germany were appointed to fulfill orders at Fabergé 2 years after the Balmoral visit, we can pinpoint Werfel as being the very likely source for the agate bowl. Now, as the former Fabergé workmaster Franz Beerbaum mentioned in his memoirs, the jeweled handle of a Kofsch was sometimes a frame, as in a support system, for the native hardstone that it was showcasing. And this, for us, creates a fascinating interplay between noble and more common stones. Fabergé repeatedly showcased native hardstones, worked beautifully and only minimally enhanced by a touch of diamond or ruby. And what better way to express a diplomatic or a state gift than by using the Kofsch form, which was recalling traditional wooden labels that were in existence well before Peter the Great's reforms. These had already been used by 16th century Muscovite czars as precious metal presentation gifts. Now, many firms apart from the House of Fabergé supplied Kofsches, but it was Fabergé working as court supplier, who influenced the preference for domestic materials to be worked into gifts for foreigners. Kofschi carved in hard stone with jeweled handles set with imperial emblems were a particularly prestigious gift for heads of state and for dignitaries abroad. Designs were initiated and proposed by the House of Fabergé, but for diplomatic presentations, they had to be agreed by the Ministry of the Imperial Court, who favored, of course, the showcasing of the empire's natural resources. Now, another interesting strand slash rabbit hole that I fed into was the written accounts of the 1896 Balmoral visit, which came to the images of that visit came to shape our image of Russian royalty, both on and off duty. And the date of the presentation of the Churchill Kofsch coincided not only with the departure of the Russian party, but also an historic occasion when the first ever moving image of Queen Victoria was filmed. And she was seen led around her gardens in a pony trap flanked by Nicholas and Alexandra. And thus this first ever film that was disseminated right across the British Empire also featured the Russian couple. So to close, I'm returning to the image of this unremarkable wooden box, which contained a courtly gift presented by Nicholas II at the conclusion of the visit to Balmoral. It evoked design and presentation of Fabergé objects gifted by the Russian imperial family during their travels abroad, and also showed a break with with standard protocol. It offered insight into the firm's hardstone output, as well as a pretext to explore messages implicit in moving pictures. So this splendid presentation by Nicholas II remains for us an evocative souvenir of a historic voyage that both strengthened and strained at Anglo-Russian ties. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful. It's such a pleasure to hear about the book in such detail. And now we're ready for our собеседник, Ekaterina Pravilova.
Thank you so much for inviting me to contribute to the discussion. I must apologize. I will have to. My comments will be very, very short because I have to run to teach at 1:30. I need to cross the campus. Maybe I will limit myself to 5 to 7 minutes. And let me begin with saying that, of course, my approach to the problem of gifts and art objects as gifts is slightly different because I'm not an art historian. I'm a historian, and I can see a lot of very interesting like turns and angles in which the discussion can go. Because what these wonderful papers present in terms of there are several stories. One is a story of the political economy of gift giving, and there is an interaction between someone who is a giver, who delivers the gift, and the recipient. And in this case, there are two countries, two empires, sometimes maybe two emperors or two rulers. And of course, when we think about this, the role of gifts in diplomacy and the political economy of giving, what comes to mind, and of course, this very rich literature, anthropological literature, starting from like Moss and Bronislaw Chmielowski, and also most recently, Annette Wiener, who is an anthropologist, who wrote a very interesting book about inalienable possession, the products of keeping while giving, which I think that, by the way, can help solve some of the issues raised in this papers when it was unclear whether it was a gift or not gift, right? Because sometimes an object, perhaps in the portrait, which is given to someone, remains with the giver, right? So it's a paradoxical situation when the gift doesn't have to be transferred. So there is the meaning is already in the act of producing the portraits or something else. So I think this anthropological dimensions is very, very interesting. And at the same time, there is this another problem, the problem of artistic production, and especially in this papers on portraits, the portraits of Potemkin, Peter the Great, and Alexander I, we can see an interaction between the artist and the original, right? The someone who is portrayed. And as a person who I'm myself more interested in, of course, in the later period, that what came to my mind is this a very bizarre, perhaps, but very modernist article by Nikolai Евреинов. This is early 20th century, Оригинал о портретистах. He was not an art historian, but someone who is very interested in the problem of subjectivity. So he analyzed several portraits of himself done by several artists, and what he claims that this is not me. This is all portraits of the artists themselves. So there is so much of them in these artworks that myself, I'm almost disappearing. And I was thinking about, especially portraits as gifts through this perspective, to what extent artists who produce this commissioned portrait had to suspend their subjectivity. So how much of Kneller is in those portraits, or how much of Alexander is both in the portraits of made by these two, perhaps even competing artists. And especially when we deal with this portrait commission for official occasions, this process of negotiating is very interesting. And this is absolutely amazing that Alison was able to find this correspondence in the letters that reflect on the process of the emperor sitting for the artist, because I think this is very interesting, and we can think even like historically why this letter was written, right? So what was it? Perhaps it was just a justification on an attempt to say that this image was sanctioned by the emperor, right? So what exactly he wanted to say? So the emperor kind of approved that on the so kind of the whole negotiation process is here described. And I also thought about the parallel, because I'm also teaching class on 18th century. There's a lot of discussion about patronage and odes. So perhaps another parallel to this idea of portraits is textual kind of donations or the odes written by writers for the emperors, for the rulers. I think that there is a lot of this correspondence. And in this both chapters on portraits, I also found very interesting this theme of what happened, the afterlife, as Louise pointed out, of the portraits. And I can maybe from my side, I can contribute a little bit to that, because I was really fascinated by the fact that Deo brought with himself an engraver. Right, so he thought about to produce perhaps the engravings from the portraits of Alexander I. And when I worked on the problem of Russian copyright, I actually found Door's letter to Alexander III of 1825, just shortly before Alexander's death, where he complained that the portrait had been illegally reproduced by other engravers, and he found out that Russia was considering issuing a copyright law protecting the artistic property of artists. So this is kind of another dimension of relationship between England and Russia, because in England there was copyright, right? There was protection protected by the artistic property, whereas in Russia it was like empty space. And interestingly, this letter was included in the correspondence related to the production of this law on copyright, because it was initially meant to be only related to literary property, and then this letter kind of generated discussion that we also need to include artistic property in this category. And indeed, in 1828, this law was written and produced. This theme of copyright, I think, was also resonates with what Ekaterina mentioned, that how Russians took the telescope that they did make themselves and gave them to others. And I think this is also a fascinating kind of alienation of someone that doesn't belong to you, which is very typical, I guess, for how Russia handled technology, nothing there is also no patent legislation of any sort. And the whole story on telescope, I think, is just the whole paper. I found completely fascinating. This it shows you a mastery of interpreting this the meaning of this mundane objects. And what came to my mind also about telescope is it definitely has a very long history of being gifts, of being a very particular kind of gift. And Maria Biaggioli, who's a historian of science, has written an article about Leonardo and Medici. And Leonardo gave a telescope that he himself produced to the Medici, Medici, but there was a meaning to it. Not only that it was a gift of his own thing that what he made himself, but also by giving the telescope, he was giving the stars. So that was the context of that. And also he tried to patent in a way that the phenomenon, the astronomical phenomenon that he discovered. So telescopes, I don't know whether the English viewers knew about this context, but it has been telescopes have been seen as very particular kind of gifts for quite a while. In this article about their plants and horses, of course, there are lots can be said about this. And you mentioned in your discussion the Anglomania of early 20th century was in the context of course, England being seen as agricultural superpower as well. And we know that the Russian nobility the ordered and en masse this seeds, plants, as well as agricultural machines. So I wondered to what extent this also affected. And of course, I have lots of questions: who created these gifts, whether they were reciprocated, and so on and so forth. And the usefulness of these gifts, I have to answer soon. The usefulness of these gifts, I think it's so much contrasted by, especially this trinket, this kosh, right, which is essentially useless thing that could be only shown and demonstrated to someone. And I found this article also fascinating. But there are some details that really caught my attention. For instance, the other gift that came along, this silver cup with Russian coins, and this is 1896, just before Russian monetary reform. And like historian in finance can say that it must have had some kind of meanings that appeared, and this just the interplay, this contrast between not so valuable material of these hard stones, from which Russians were making columns for instance, for the art museum in Moscow, right? So just the scale is completely different, and this the materials. I think this is very telling. I'm sorry I have to cut my comments short, but I truly enjoy reading these papers and listening to the presentations, and also looking at all these wonderful illustrations and pictures. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ekaterina. We are really lucky to have you as a discussant with bringing up so many good points. And we do have several minutes left for questions and discussion. So if anybody would like to pick up on what we just heard, we would be glad to have some discussion.
Shall I begin with a little bit about the portraits?
Sure.
Yes. So about portraits, I thank Katya for that very useful observation about the motives of the artists and the commissioner, which are particularly pertinent in the case of these diplomatic and state portraits. And interesting layer as well, which I think was picked up in Alison's paper as well, is that if you are commissioning a foreign artist to paint your portrait, then how do you control the output of that? And would that influence the way that the result comes out, because you've brought that transnational aspect of it? And certainly in my chapter, I did find it difficult to assess the purpose of the portraits, so particularly the one of Potemkin, the ambassador portrait, in which I had initially wondered whether it was the ambassador himself who had commissioned this portrait from Nella. And it's actually quite difficult to answer these questions because, as I was alluding to in the introductory session, a lot of the documentation is missing, and you're looking for sort of literature, you're looking for hints that might tell you one way or the other. And it was interesting to note that the diplomatic portrait as such is a thing. So Potemkin had been in Spain and he'd had his portrait painted there, and then his portrait painted again. So there are ways in which these events are recorded through the paintings that are made of those events. And it's a theme that came up again with Stephen Patterson's chapter, the way that the wedding, the royal wedding, had to be memorialized. And it wasn't just about Queen Victoria needing to see what was happening, although there were some interesting anecdotes about how a sketch was created with little paper flaps so that she could lift them up and sort of see what was happening at various stages of the Orthodox marriage ceremony. They also had a state purpose, an official purpose of actually recording the events that were taking place. So anyway, that's a comment from me on the portrait side of things.
I'll pick it up if I might, since I thought Katya's comments for me too, in terms of thinking about portraits and sort of evidence and history versus art history. I thought a lot of what she said was really spot on. When she asked sort of how much of Alexander is in these portraits, and what is the negotiation exactly between English artists like Thomas Lawrence, like George Daw, with someone who is such a huge authority figure, and when there's so much riding on the commissions of those portraits for different spaces and slightly different purposes. I think that's what I found so interesting about, in terms of the letters that I found. Initially, what I wanted to know was everything. I wanted to sort of imaginatively recreate what it was actually like for someone like Sir Thomas Lawrence to be in a room with the Tsar. Who else was there? Did they talk to each other? It was really sort of basic historical work. And I think when I found that there were those letters and it's sort of, in-depth testament to exactly the interaction that Katya was saying she wanted to sort of know more about or understand more in terms of how much is Alexander dictating how he looks when it's a foreign artist, like Louise was saying, when there's a kind of cultural diplomacy going on. And I think what I was struck by, at least in this one particular case, is how much Lawrence did want to please the Tsar, and how much the Tsar was telling him, like, my legs don't look like that. Don't, you need to redo the legs. At one point in the chapter, I talk about the fact that apparently Lawrence did redo them. And there's sort of like, there was a stage in which there were 4 legs in the picture, and the Tsar's retinue was like, this won't do, you have to fix that. And Lawrence was like, I will, I'm worried, like, this is how the process goes in terms of I'm trying to repaint it. So that process of examination and interaction, I think I got lucky that the case that I chose to work on had so much evidence that I could work with in the Fuller chapter to flesh out some of these dynamics.
Great, thank you. So any questions, any further questions or things that you wanted to ask each other, the contributors?
Yeah, this is just a very general question about gift giving, and the decision to give a gift with utility or a gift without any utility, and how that was weighted. You talked about it a little bit, but could you say a little bit more? What does, a jewel-encrusted egg signify compared to a telescope?
It sounds like partly a Fabergé question, but I'm going to step away from the eggs because one of my missions in life is to explore the fact that Fabergé created a breadth of other, a huge output apart from the eggs. And yes, technically it's a useless object, but I think that implicit in that Kofsch, of course, being the ladle, the brotherhood, the idea of very often these gifts between the emperor and men of status would involve this Kofsch form. The Kofsch form was also utilized very much by Nicholas II in gifts that I've studied to the British Navy. So the British, the trophy room here has several extraordinary Kofsches, which by the time you've sort of played around with the form, ends up looking like a sort of a Viking, a boat with a tall mast. So implicit in those forms are all sorts of, I think, very strong, we could say traditionally male messages that Nicholas II was keen to give out. I was particularly interested in the choice of the agate stone, because normally these gifts would have been in this particular jade called nephrite, the Siberian jade. And this continues to puzzle me, and it may be fanciful, but I wonder if there's some sort of connection with the crimson tunics of sort of that regiments wear. So we are very much in this this male sphere with this this traditional Kofsch shape. So I don't know if that touches on what you were getting at.
Yeah, that's definitely, I mean, I think I would have guessed that these shapes have implicit in them kind of references to various forms of utility. I guess I'm actually specifically interested in non-utility. You know, I mean, is it, I just, this is kind of random, but I was at the huge national museum in Taiwan, and with all the things that they took from mainland China, and so many of the things were gifts to the emperor, from the emperor, and they seem to really lean into the non-utility. You know, here's a giant carved cabbage in which magically inside of it is another giant carved cabbage, and it's all from the same piece of jewel stone. So I was wondering if there's a certain glamour to things being useless.
Yes, I mean, sorry, again, I'm going to just give a Fabergé answer. It's, yes, in terms of something that is so beautifully carved, love it or hate it. The idea that you can put together a wood or brick with diamond and elevate or the object simply through the exquisite craftsmanship. And those in the know then appreciate that your cabbage, for example, may have been made with just the most exquisite attention to detail. And it's something that transcends then taste and good taste very often.
I think if I can add into that, it does bring into the debate this question, which the book touches on in various ways, which is the value of art as such, as a diplomatic present, and the way that you can have, in the case of Cynthia's Fabergé example, you've got the example of something which at the time that it was given, when the reputation of Fabergé among the elite was of a certain level, that would have had a value in itself. And then we can contrast that with Katya's presentation, where she talked a bit about the underhand messages, the underlying messages, which could sometimes have been negative and more about the power play, the kind of diplomatic hierarchies and relations, which Katya talked about in terms of the broader history of diplomatic gift giving and what it means in terms of state relations. So I think there are those layers which are crossing in slightly different ways, which are brought out in the book as a whole.
So I'm just going to, I don't see other hands up, but I just wanted to ask then and intervene and say, so it's clear that the gift giving is well thought out. The gifts are thought out on the part of the giver, what this means, the symbolism, the minerals used, the materials, the fact that this is our horse breeding and so on. But I was wondering, to what extent, Katya or Cynthia or Allison, to what extent do the recipients, does the emperor, Tsar, king, are they the interpreters, or would it be the members of the court or the people who are recording these things and placing them in the registrar kind of person? Would that be the person who would interpret, or perhaps ministers, would they be the ones who were kind of interpreting the underlying meanings? Yeah, Katya, was that you?
Yeah, good question.
I think, well, from my sources, it's not clear. I think a lot of it, empress or grand dukes had to do themselves, but they had people advising them on the significance of various things, significance of plants or significance of telescope. So that what I have is just the actions of these people and where they received the gift, because it had significance. So, for example, Maria Fedorovna received the plants of flax in the palace, whereas everything else she received in the hothouse. The flax was received in Pavlovsk Palace as something special. So you can see that she sees the difference between the rest of the gift and that, and she received it in 3 types of forms: as a seed, as a drawing, but also as a finished product, as a basically piece of fabric. So that she really saw that this was something special to be treated differently. I don't really have any information about who helped them interpret the gifts, but
well, that's really kind of lays it all out for her. That makes the message very clear what's going on there. Yeah, we can make our own sales. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. Cynthia, were you going to say something?
I was just going to add that in terms of the Fabergé had a really strong hand in the design and the appearance of the objects. Obviously, the official organs, the court, were interested in seeing these gifts abroad incorporate the native stones, as I said. But what was interesting is that Fabergé, we know that did not consider the court to be terribly au fait with style, didn't really think that the people who were judging the work were really knowledgeable. So Fabergé was known, and especially around these kovshes, these official gifts, to create a few drawings for submission, and submit one drawing that was much more detailed than the others. And inevitably, the court would choose that particular item for gifting. So we know that the thing that's quite extraordinary is we know that Nicholas II really was involved in the choice of the gifts for this particular voyage, which is what makes this group of gifts so interesting. Why, how these were chosen, what the subtext is, why this was chosen, again, as I said before, in the stone that it was chosen. There's something, it may be fanciful, but there's some connection between, obviously, the recipient that he had in mind for the choice of that gift. And we would just, given how little information survives, I don't know how we're ever going to trace that. But I will make it my life's mission to try.
So interesting. Thank you. So we have a question from Nikita Balagurov.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Louise, and all the contributors for this fascinating volume, and especially the moment when I'm myself working on the introduction for a project which deals with the Romanovs and the material culture. So I'm eager to read such contributions which deal with material aspects. And if we look at the historiographic landscape, there are a couple of edited volumes which are dedicated to the issues of materiality with regard to Russian materials, but they mostly have this focus on Soviet period, and there are these notions of socialist objects or comradely objects, to cite some of the titles in the historiography. And I think that your volume is such a great contribution to this. The research into the objects of these imperial times, and I was wondering if we can think about imperial objects. How can we conceptualize those objects? And I think one of the ways through which your volume discusses this aspect, and I could only have time. I only had time to read the introduction of several of the chapters of this volume. Is that this volume shows how, in different ways, this gift exchange this facilitates what is called in historiography the making of this royal nation. So how these two dynasties, two monarchies kind of make these bonds, political, cultural, intimate, familial bonds through gift giving and gift exchange. So I was just wondering, just a question for everyone about making sense of these imperial objects. So I understand that in your volume there are shown different ways of how this how was this practice, and if I remember correctly, Louise is writing in the introduction that you don't want to provide a very limited take on this aspect, but still maybe you have some thoughts. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
I could start by a couple of observations. Thank you very much for your very kind words, Nikita. That it's good to hear that somebody is reading the book, and you always want that as an editor of a volume of this type. I think the idea, certainly with the volume, as with all our edited volumes, was the idea that lots of case studies sort of cohere to bring up lots of threads without necessarily solving any of them. So you're kind of making this some that's greater than the parts, but on the other hand, you may not necessarily, well, it may depend on the volume, but certainly I think the idea of imperial objects is an interesting one and quite difficult to conceptualize. It would be great if you are heading a project in that direction. I think in terms of the way it affected this volume was starting to look at some of these relationships which I think are often not emphasized strongly enough. So the familial relationships and the way that there were indeed some sharing of visual culture in the way that both in the final chapter, the chapter on photographs sort of talks about that very directly. And we saw the legacies of that in the exhibition catalogue, just the volume of material relating to dynastic relations that suggests almost this kind of that they're operating at a different level above the rest. Katya's comments mentioned commerce, and I was going to bring that in as well, that the ways in which this is both a narrow debate sort of within the context of the royals and their royal families, and quite narrow circles, actually, the court circles, the diplomats, very select groups of people who are exchanging these objects. And yet there are ramifications beyond that for commerce, for artistic commerce. So as Cynthia's chapter reveals about Fabergé and the way that actually the Russians were trying to get Russian hardstone out onto the market as a desirable thing to have. And by giving gifts to people, you would be spreading the word about your artistic culture. And the other thing that comes up in some of the earlier chapters, like Alison's, is the way that artists themselves were using this imperial patronage to seek opportunities to launch their own careers. And so for a certain set of British artists, it was a good thing to go to St. Petersburg at this time, because they thought, Alison didn't mention it in her presentation, but it's in her chapter, this lovely phrase, creeping and prowling around the court, which is this idea that George Daw was kind of looking for these opportunities there as well. So I think that there is both this narrower view and this wider view as well. How one would, yes, it depends how we define imperial as well. One thing I should have added actually at the start was that this book was finished before before March 2022. So we are not looking at it with any of the kind of post-22 lenses. But the centres of action were actually quite limited to Moscow, St. Petersburg and London, and really these royal centres. So it is quite specific to that framework, that sphere.
That makes sense. Thank you. Yes, as we approach 1:30, which is not an absolute cutoff, but is sort of our guiding time to start wrapping up. Would any of the contributors like to say anything about the sort of broader concept of an imperial object as opposed to a socialist object, or as opposed to, I think that's a great kind of comparison that you bring up, Nikita. Imperial objects.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I liked what you said a lot too, Nikita and Louise. I'm glad you brought up that point about George Daw prowling and creeping around. And I'll only add to that, I love the part of my chapter, which I also didn't mention, where Thomas Lawrence is being super secretive about his work because he's worried that Daw will see it and copy what he did in order to be successful. And it's ironic that Daw ends up being sort of the more successful representation, even though Lawrence was so concerned about him creeping around. Making sense of these imperial objects. I think from my standpoint, since so much of what I wanted to work on, and I was always worried that my chapter was a little bit of an outlier, it doesn't speak so directly to gifts, but to this diplomacy. And I will only praise our fearless editor, Louise, who I think really helped me shape my chapter such that it did, fit in terms of thinking about these larger issues. But I almost thought when you said that, Nikita, that I might translate that in my own case to making sense of how almost how those portraits in that military gallery are constituting a kind of imperial masculinity, a sort of dominating gender sensibility that is very much a kind of top down, like those who enter that space in the palace, which isn't publicly accessible to everybody, but those who do will see these men, this just wall of men, and be influenced about how you hold yourself, conveying something about you as a man, how the Tsar, as the sort of larger full-length portrait, is going to sort of teach the generals teach the officers teach the soldiers, like this. There's a sort of imperial gender domination happening in that space that ultimately isn't successful, which is the weird thing about it. But the desire, I think, to assess that desire alone is fascinating in that particular monument, in that particular moment.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else want to say something? If not, I'll call on Marina Forbes.
Hi, and I just want to make a probably final comment from very personal perspective, because being a student in St. Petersburg, going to school in St. Petersburg, being a student of St. Petersburg University, we spent tons of time with the Hermitage Museum, and being kind of like a teenager, I was totally fascinated by 1812 War Gallery. And what I was fascinated with, how young were those generals? And thinking about being a student, kind of going to school and all this Politburo type of people in general, they were just kind of substantial age. And here, all the guys were so young. And of course, some portraits, they were just, they had green taffeta because those generals died, and kind of their images were not available to create portraits. But I think it's very important talking about generals and their age. They were very young. And right now I would say they were very young and very attractive. Thank you.
I'm glad you're raising that point, and maybe it goes back to what I said at the start of my little talk about, I just have always been so fascinated by that space ever since I first entered it. And I think it partly is like a very human, I don't know, very like hetero thing that happened to me when I was first in there, in terms of, you're right, they're young. Many of them are very handsome. And of course, they're depicted in this sort of, swirling, romantic, sort of heroic masculinity way. And I mean, maybe as a scholar, I shouldn't admit things like this, but I think partly I was charmed by just like all these handsome young men initially. But then that made me think, okay, well, how is this working on me ideologically now in the 21st century? That had to have been a factor moving backwards. Though, of course, we have to account for differences in those contexts. But I think you're right to point out that youth and heroism, that there's a number of things that are intersecting there that are all really powerful and valuable, and that are still sort of resonating to us across time today.
Great. Thank you, Allison. Thank you. So with that, I think we're just reached our moment, reached our time. And I just want to say thank you so much to everyone. Thank you, Louise, for presenting and organizing this wonderful edited volume. Many thanks to Katya Heath, Cynthia Coleman-Spark, and Allison Lee for your sharing your work with us, and to Katya Pravilova for her Sabisednik comments. Really great. And we are looking forward to having you all back, all the listeners and participants back at the end of October, October 25th. We'll be hearing from Paul Worth, who recently wrote a book about the year 1837. So a discussion about the 1830s with the discussant Sabisednik, Jennifer Flaherty. So we're looking forward to seeing you then. Thank you all so much.